Welcome to my ranking of all 14 seasons of modern Doctor Who. Please be in mind that these rankings aren't set in stone and are subject to change in future rankings. Let me know what your ranking is in the comments below, and without further ado, let's get into it. Series 7 is often regarded as one of the weaker entries in the revival era, and while I've tried to give it a fair chance and rewatch it and see if it is that bad, I do struggle to go back to this season. I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad outside of Asylum of the Daleks, but there are no real highlights to get me all that interested in checking it out again. I don't think the mid-series split helped it either, as there's a weird tonal shift halfway through, and certain plot points are dropped and forgotten about. Unlike most people, I think I prefer the first half with Amy and Rory to the main focus, which is the 11th Doctor and Clara. I don't think they have the best relationship, and the reason they are together isn't really that interesting. The divorce stuff is really bad, but otherwise the arc of Amy and Rory being uncertain whether it's time to leave the TARDIS and making the wrong choice, combined with the fact that they already had an established relationship with the 11th Doctor, I'm far more invested in that storyline. I wouldn't say they have the best dynamic, and there are some unhealthy implications to why the Doctor wants to travel with her, and speaking of which, this is the point where 11 starts to be a bit creepy at points. Matt Smith continues to be as great as ever and gives it his all, but once in a while some of Moffat's weird tendencies begin to slip into his characterization. I do like some of the aesthetics of the second half, such as the new TARDIS console room and the Doctor's new costume, which is probably the most classic Doctor style outfit we've ever gotten in the revival. Poor Jenna Coleman doesn't necessarily get the best start with Clara in this season, though thankfully she does improve over time. But I feel this is the point where the present day Earth archetype started to become a bit more tiresome, especially given that we almost got a break from that with the Victorian version of Clara. Overall, I'd say it's not the worst season, but it is the least interesting in my opinion. If I were to pick a favourite episode from the season, I'd probably say the one I enjoy the most is A Town Called Mercy. But otherwise, everything else is just a bit forgettable. Series 11 is by far the most back-to-basics season of modern Doctor Who, and when it first came out immediately after the Moffat era, it was somewhat of a breath of fresh air, but in hindsight, I struggled to come back to this season and era overall, as I kind of find it a bit boring at points. When looking at the Chibnall pen script specifically, I'll give the Ghost Monument and the finale the credit that they are at least interesting ideas that are let down by the lack of runtime and resources to do them justice, but his 3 other episodes are some of the most generic concepts, not only for Doctor Who but basic pop culture. This does give the season a bit more general audience appeal, and I can see why some people less genre savvy and cynical as me would enjoy these episodes, as technically they're not bad, they're just not that creative and nothing you haven't really seen before from other versions of generic White Corridor spaceship episodes or giant bug B-movie type episodes. Things definitely improve thanks to the guest writers, as they bring us the highlights of Series 11. Not always good stories, but they're a lot more interesting in my opinion. The best definitely being the 3 historicals, though I do wish they had the courage to maybe make at least one of them a pure historical, as with all of them the sci-fi aspects do let it down. And I'd say the same goes for the TARDIS team. While Yaz becomes a more interesting companion later, here she doesn't have that much to do, and maybe having a companion from the past and the future would help mix up this team, especially since Graham and Ryan are already covering the present day Earth character drama, and they're easily the highlight of the team. Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor is fine considering how over the top everyone was about her casting, but I do feel trying to do the more introverted, shy Doctor doesn't quite work for a TARDIS team this big, and she maybe needed a bit more focus at points. Sometimes the exaggerated characteristics she's given to make her stand out can come off as a bit grating, though she does have her fair share of endearing moments. For me, the highlight of Series 11 has to be It Takes You Away. It's the most creative concept, and I feel it has the best emotional moments for our lead characters. And I wish we'd gotten more episodes like this and Demons of the Punjab, which is a close second, as it's capable of greatness, but otherwise I think this season plays it a bit too safe. Considering everything going against Series 13 behind the scenes, it was a welcome surprise to see just how much I enjoyed this season. I feel like because Chris Chibnall had to think outside the box, he was allowed the opportunity to actually be a bit more creative and actually enjoy himself this season. I think having to separate the main cast as well as reducing the number of actors in the stories really benefited the 13th Doctor and Yaz, as they were allowed much more focus, and it's not the most interesting stuff, but there is definitely more dimension to them this time around, and I feel it retroactively makes Yaz the 13th Doctor's definitive companion. Dan isn't always necessary, but he is a fun addition and acts as emotional support for Yaz. Since they're going the route of the Doctor being quite closed off, it can get frustrating at times for the audience and by extension Yaz, so having him as basically her companion is an interesting dynamic. With that being said, this season has a lot of narrative issues, so most of my enjoyment is pretty much ironic, with some few genuine things that I do think are done very well, like the 2 episodes that focus on the Sontarans and the Weeping Angels. They don't do anything new with these villains, but act as a celebration of everything we love about those 2 monsters. Going in, I had no expectation of the Flux storyline to have a satisfying conclusion, so I went in not expecting to find the finale satisfying, especially with the false promise of more focus towards the timeless children. So I was less angry with the Vanquishers and was able to enjoy all the madness in those final 2 episodes. They're a mess undeniably, but at least an entertaining mess. I do wish the Ravagers had been given more to do, as they started off as really interesting villains, but the fact that they just sort of lost focus towards the end, I'm not mad about it. I just learnt to stop caring about this stuff after the Timeless Children. So to conclude, compared to most people, I'm a lot more forgiving of Flux's mistakes, as I can appreciate the attempts to actually be quite creative. Even with stuff like exposition, episodes like Once Upon a Time taking advantage of the limited cast by going the Zagreus route of having everyone play multiple characters, I was able to pick up enough hints in the text to headcanon that the destruction that the Flux caused was fixed off screen, even though that isn't necessarily the best way to handle such a major storyline. While the serialized format didn't really have the best execution, it was nice to see it again, as it allowed for some great cliffhangers and some experimental storytelling. While consensus was pretty negative on Series 9 when it first came out, I do feel that my personal anger towards it at the time was grossly exaggerated and very unfair to the ultimate product. Right in the middle of my battle with mental health, I really didn't have the patience for Moffat's trollish sense of humour and the lack of any satisfying answers to the ongoing story. This is the point where I started to get a bit bored with the ongoing mystery box story arcs, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it was the same for Stephen himself, given how awkwardly the hybrid is introduced and how it ultimately goes nowhere, I definitely get the sense that he wanted to drop them but was being obligated to put them in for the sake of formula. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happened. With a few years past, a clearer mind and a better mental state, does Series 9 improve somewhat in my standing? And I would say, sort of. I am at least a bit more forgiving of some of the creative choices. I get the feeling that there were a lot of behind the scenes issues. Up until the final 3 episodes, Clara does feel like a last minute addition. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a draft of The Witch is Familiar where Davros didn't survive. The 12th Doctor being presented as having a more literal midlife crisis isn't as interesting as what was going on in Series 8, but it does still have some interesting elements. I like the use of his social cue cards, and the fact that we also have the serious aspect of him coming to terms with not only his mortality, but those he fails to save. First the Shielder, and then eventually Clara. And regardless of how his story turned out, Heaven Sent will always be a great story. While the more loose 2-parter setup does have some interesting potential seen in something like Under the Lake and Before the Flood, with other episodes it doesn't really work, and it's annoying that that became the precedent for multi-story arcs, as it just feels like the main episode's plot just gets dropped in the second half. I like episodes such as The Witch is Familiar and The Woman Who Lived in theory, what they were going for, these very understated character pieces, but a lot of shoehorned elements really let them down. This is where I find Missy the least endearing, and some of the humour can get on my nerves at points. But what I will give this season is that it's not boring. Looking back on the season after the Chibnall era, I can say that the stories I consider bad are at least bad in an interesting way, and there's a lot to talk about. Say what you will about Hellbent, it is a fascinating story. Series 6 generally seems to be regarded as the turning point in Doctor Who, where the qualities seem to go down for some people. While I do think it is better than people give it credit for, I would say there's enough issues for me not to call it a guilty pleasure. I do appreciate that Stephen tried to introduce a few shake-ups this year, not only starting with a 2-parter, but mixing things up by having the TARDIS team from the previous season stick around, which makes sense in terms of allowing for the characters to grow, but considering how similar the modern companions tend to be, it seems more practical than just replacing them with basically the same people played by different actors. And speaking of which, I do appreciate how much the 11th Doctor grows this season. A lot of people say this is when he became a bit too silly, but I disagree, as at points we get to see the implication that his goofy side is something that he's putting on for Amy and Rory, and occasionally that mask slips and he's forced to take more cold choices. River Song has a somewhat promising start, but once we see the younger version of her, I really lose interest because she gets very grating and obnoxious at points. What ultimately brings this season down is the incredibly messy mystery box, with way too many threads and the lack of a satisfying conclusion by the end. It meant that a lot of people kind of lost interest. Series 6 definitely has its fair share of legitimately great episodes. I think it starts strong with the Astronaut 2-parter. We've also got The Doctor's Wife, The Girl Who Waited, which is my personal favourite, and The God Complex, which is very surreal. But then we have quite a few very uninteresting filler episodes, which are quite forgettable, and given how people are just desperate for the answers that Moffat is trying to hint towards them, these not particularly interesting stories do come off as a lot weaker because it's just wasting people's time. Though I can look back on it fondly, retroactively, when it first came out, it really needed to stick the landing in order for this new era to succeed, and sadly, because that wasn't the case, I do feel it impacted the rest of the Moffat era and it never quite recovered. To give Series 12 some credit to begin with, it does improve on some of the issues of Series 11, such as giving Yaz and the Doctor a bit more to do this time around. Unfortunately, it brings its own set of problems. Most notably trying to emulate the previous two eras, which I can see why they want to do that in theory, but with the lackluster execution, not only does it lead to this era feeling even more derivative, it's done in a way that has less appeal to a casual audience. While Sacha Dhawan is undeniably a highlight as the Master, his presence causes the return of the Series 9 issue of treating two-parters as basically separate stories, causing the ongoing plot to fall apart. Like Series 6, it treats the episodes not connected to the ongoing story arc as filler, which is a shame because I do really like Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, and while Praxeus and Can You Hear Me have their issues, I do still enjoy them. Speaking of the story arc, we also have the return of the mystery box, which leads to a supposed game-changing reveal that ultimately either disappoints, confuses, or annoys people. So this is the point where I learnt to stop caring about the mystery boxes. I knew ultimately whatever happens, they weren't ever going to go anywhere. At the time, I was curious to know how all the different contrasting elements were going to connect together, and the answer was simply that they weren't. It's just a bunch of random ideas which, in theory, could have been brought together into a coherent puzzle, but ultimately had nothing to do with each other. The destruction of Gallifrey, a secret doctor, a Cyberman with emotions seeking some sort of device. Personally, I would have made Ashad be the one who invades Gallifrey, specifically for the purpose of trying to find the means to make sure Cybermen can survive without the emotional inhibitor. Thus, that's why they get the ability to regenerate, and the fugitive doctor is from a timeline where she fails to stop him and goes back to warn her younger self. So while I don't view Chris Chibnall as some evil mastermind trying to destroy Doctor Who, looking at how this was executed, I don't really see any passion or emotional connection to these ideas, despite what he may have stated in interviews. I'd say his weakness is more as the script editor than a writer, as a lot of the most infamous moments from this era that people debate about, all those odd lines of dialogue with morally questionable implications, in theory could have been fixed by a second-hand perspective, just asking very simple questions. Questions such as, is Orphan 55 a dark comedy, or are we supposed to take it seriously? Do the episodes need so much exposition, and does the 13th Doctor have some superficial and callous tendencies, or is she just too anxious to open up to people? While it's hard to deny this being the weakest season of the Russell era, I still have a soft spot for Series 2. I know the darker side of the 10th Doctor is a lot more palatable, but I feel the more lighter episodes we get here are essential to his character arc, as it's the calm before the storm, I suppose. This time around, the arc isn't that much of a focus, and as a result we get a lot more standalone stories, which, depending on the quality of the episode, is a positive and a negative, as the weaker stuff is not only a step down from what we got in Series 1, but now it's a case of being completely skippable if you're not enjoying it. For me, I do enjoy the likes of Love of Monsters and Fear Her, at least on an ironic basis. Do you know what I do love about this era? Jackie Tyler. Camille Coduri is great. I feel that the relationship between the Doctor and Rose is a bit of a step down here. It's not as egregious as a lot of people say that it is, but when it comes to their romance, I feel absolutely nothing, which is a bit of an issue considering how much of a focal point it is for the rest of the 10th Doctor's run. Of the two, I'd say the weak link was probably Rose, as I do feel there's plenty of nuanced and well written moments for the 10th Doctor this season. And it's interesting to see the more chipper version of his incarnation here. There is still plenty to love about Series 2, however. Not only do we get some more classic Who representation with the Impossible Planet Satan Pit two-parter acting as the modern reinvention of the Base Under Siege format, but also the return of Sarah Jane Smith, who acts as an ambassador for both the classic and modern series. We also have the return of the Cybermen, which on the one hand bring back the body horror, which is something the classic series overlooked, but also introduces the idea of having another villain overshadow them. Doomsday is a surprisingly fun finale when it's focused on the Dalek Cybermen action rather than the melodrama between the Doctor and Rose. Overall, a very cheesy season of Doctor Who, but I feel that's part of its charm. An interesting comparison I'd make to describe my thoughts on Series 3 is that it reminds me a lot of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. Incredibly well put together, for the most part knows the tone it wants to go for, has an incredibly strong guest cast who undeniably became famous following this release. However, it suffers from a major issue, being the emotional and romantic storylines of the main characters. This is the point where we get to see the more angsty version of the 10th Doctor, which some of it works and some of it doesn't. David Tennant really does justice to the Doctor's regret regarding being the last of the Time Lords. However, his obsession with Rose and trying to convince us that John Sims' version of the Master is supposed to be sympathetic, I don't really buy that, so at points I can find him quite unlikable, which is admittedly intentional, and his neglect of Martha is meant to be the point, but I still feel bad for her and feel that she deserved a bit more focus, as I prefer Martha to Rose on the whole. Thankfully, we get a break from the 10th Doctor with Human Nature and Blink, which are not only the strongest stories of this season and potentially some of the best Doctor Who ever made, it's another example of showing love to expanded material, with both of them being adaptations, but also arguably better than the original source material. So yeah, it's not without its problems, but there's so much good in Series 3 that I can overlook, sometimes finding the 10th Doctor a bit grating, as other times he is just as great as people say. This is absolutely the point where Russell found his stride and knew exactly what he wanted to do, and really got comfortable as the showrunner. The finale is a bit of a disappointment, but not to the extent that a lot of people say that it is. And one of the reasons I don't like the reset in the finale is the fact that it somewhat takes away the Doctor's responsibility and doesn't give an opportunity to learn from his mistake. Overall, it's a return to form after the somewhat messy Series 2, where even some of the weaker stories like Daleks in Manhattan do have a lot of creative value and interesting ideas. I had a pretty fun time with Series 14/Season 1. I feel this is mostly in part due to Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's chemistry and giving us one of the most likeable and emotionally honest TARDIS teams in the 15th Doctor and Ruby. And unlike most people, I'm pretty much all on board for Doctor Who being much more experimental with its storytelling. Doctor Who is inherently a creative show, and it's not like the stories are hugely complex. The concept of trapping the Doctor on a landmine or Ruby facing her greatest nightmare, that invites experimental storytelling, but also allows for intimate introspection of our lead characters. So yeah, I really hope this more fantastical aspect of the era gets more focus and becomes more of a major plotline going forward. But I will admit, it could have been much stronger, and I feel this is down to the fact as fresh as this era tries to be, especially with the return of Rusty Davies, I found that the callbacks to previous eras are getting a bit more tired. We have a lot of the traditional problems cropping up. Some tonal issues, not being sure who the audience for the show is at this point. Russell is clearly overworking himself, writing basically over half the season, and for me the most frustrating aspect is probably the pacing. I can understand and accept that Ncuti Gatwa's temporary absence and the limited number of episodes couldn't have been helped, but what I don't understand is if you have so many characters, plot points, and mystery boxes to keep up with, I don't understand why on earth the season was allowed the opportunity to have longer episodes. I don't get the argument that they needed to cut scenes for time, given that it's basically a streaming show now, or they should have recognised they wouldn't have managed to get the whole of The One Who Waits and Ruby's mystery with her parents' arc done in just 8 episodes, and as such probably could have spread more of the overarching plots across the next few seasons. There wasn't really much pressure to get it all done in once. I wasn't expecting to find out who The One Who Waits was until at least season 4. I think both people making Doctor Who and some of the fandom are struggling to realise that some significant format changes need to be made in order for Doctor Who to keep up with the current media landscape. Episodes don't need to be 45 minutes anymore, companions don't need to be from the present day, the mystery box doesn't need to be wrapped up quite so quickly, because otherwise it just comes off as a bit anticlimactic and dull. But I still think this is a decent season, though I do recognise why people are underwhelmed, as it really needed to be a lot more focused, in my opinion. In summary, I think the 9 episodes fall into one of 3 categories. You have the fun but generic Church on Ruby Road, Space Babies and Rogue, the experimental masterpieces Boom, 73 Yards and Dot and Bubble, and lastly Devil's Cord and the 2 finale episodes, which are somewhere in the middle, trying to be creative but ultimately get held back by tradition. I'm very conflicted about how I feel regarding Series 4, because on the one hand I can't deny it is one of the strongest seasons of modern Doctor Who, with one of the best TARDIS teams with the 10th Doctor and Donna. Very few stories I'd consider bad, just the weakest mediocre, otherwise everything is really great. With that said, I still struggle to call it the best season of all time, and would say it's somewhat a victim of being overhyped within the fandom. I think I've only just figured out why that's the case. You see, Series 4 is very experimental and takes quite a few risks. Russell, who usually focused on the more character stories, actually gave us some of his most creative concepts in Midnight and Turn Left. Ideas that he wanted to do since the very beginning, but was somewhat afraid that they would alienate people. And it doesn't pull its punches when it comes to the emotional beats and can be quite dark at points. But what makes it work is that you can clearly tell that Russell and all the guest writers clearly had a lot of love for the ideas that they were trying to bring to life here. So what I hoped the message would be from this season was, don't be afraid to take risks so long as you have the passion and creativity to do them justice. Unfortunately, I feel like the show and some of the fans looked at this season's success and goes, this era was popular, let's just randomly recreate elements from it with no rhyme or reason, which is why I fell out of this era for a long time. Which I do think is a shame, because you can tell just how excited Stephen Moffat is to set up his new era in Silence of the Library. The one exception to this rule I will grant is having the Doctor and Donna regress by the end of the season, since technically it's done in a way that feels emotionally justified. So don't get me wrong, this season is really high up for me, but that won't stop me feeling disappointed if Russell decides to go the route of rinse and repeat with his brand new era, rather than exploring any potential Midnight type stories he never got a chance to make during his original run. It's a culmination of pretty much everything from the Russell era, including the spin-offs. I don't think it necessarily sticks the landing and gives all of those elements returning time in the spotlight, but it is a undeniable, enjoyable celebration, as it feels earned across multiple seasons of television. So I do think it deserves the praise it gets, but not to the extent that it's treated as the be-all and end-all of the franchise that could never be topped. Generally regarded as one of the best seasons of modern Doctor Who, I wouldn't say that the spark that it had on initial watch is still there for me anymore, but I still really enjoy it. I feel there's a good balance between feeling like a reboot that can be a fresh start for newcomers, as well as a continuation of what came before, and the presence of a new Doctor really helps to sell that fact. Matt Smith hits the ground running, and I like that they bring quite a few elements of the classic Doctors, some of the eccentric personality traits which were somewhat lost with Eccleston and Tennant, but also maintain some of the more emotional beats of those two incarnations. Bringing back some of the elements like River Song and the Weeping Angels from the previous era does help to feel like a good continuation that expands on what was set up. Amy Pond is a decent companion, and I like the idea of the Doctor being treated as her imaginary friend, but the love triangle aspect and trying to force a romantic chemistry really doesn't work here and feels like a relic of Russell's storytelling. Thankfully, it's dropped. Under Stephen Moffat, it allows us a few more imaginative stories than Russell, while still maintaining some of the character drama. See examples like Amy's Choice and Vincent and the Doctor, which are phenomenal pieces of storytelling. There are a couple of weak links which I'm not that keen on revisiting, like the Lodger or Victory of the Daleks. Both ideas have potential, but the final execution isn't great. I'm very mixed on the Cracks in Time story arc. Because certain elements aren't resolved by the end of it, it does mean it's a little unsatisfying. What I will say is though, I do like how it's used as the ultimate in-universe explanation for a lot of continuity errors and plot holes. With a show like Doctor Who, sometimes you gotta let those things slide, but having an actual explanation does ease the frustration it can sometimes create. So would I say it's the best season of modern Doctor Who? Probably not, but it is one of the strongest. I just prefer some of the others overall. Series 8 is so much better than I remember it being, and I did not give it nearly enough credit when it first came out. I love everything that Stephen Moffat does with the 12th Doctor. Sort of takes the argument of whether he should be more like the classic Doctors or more like the modern Doctors, and turns it into a very interesting character arc, exploring how much the Doctor's changed over time and what does it mean anymore. Is he the fairy tale hero or the cold logical scientist? This season shows him trying to do the latter, and we get to see the emotional weight that has on him and Clara. Speaking of which, I like how they took the otherwise unhealthy relationship they had in the previous season and call that fact out and actually explore the potential that that has, showing that Clara is more than just one of the more generic companions, in fact giving her quite a few neuroses and potentially unlikable character traits like being somewhat of a pathological liar and wanting to be the Doctor herself and having to face the consequences of those actions, and just seeing the burden the Doctor has and having a greater respect for some of the more dark actions he takes. Even some of the weaker episodes like Kill the Moon and In the Forest of the Night do some great character stuff for them. And alongside them we also have Danny Pink, and do people actually hate him? Because I think he's really underrated and one of the highlights of this season. When it comes to the obligatory mystery box story arc, The Promised Land and Missy, both elements do have some interesting potential. However, I think it does sort of stumble towards the end because Moffat went a bit too dark with the implications of the cybernetic afterlife. He somewhat had to scramble to sort of tone down and retcon the ideas he introduced, but otherwise it just comes out as an incoherent mess by the end. But this time around, I feel that the story arc is more of a background presence this time, so a lot more episodes can stand out in their own right. I mean, you can get some fun stuff like Time Heist and Robots of Sherwood, which I feel is elevated by the presence of the 12th Doctor. Given how caricature-y most of the rest of the characters are, having the more aggressive and irritated Doctor works much better than someone like Matt Smith's more chirpy persona. And alongside that, we have some legitimately great episodes like Listen is one of my favourite all-time stories, and of course the duology from Jamie Matheson. Overall, I'm really glad that I was able to come back to this season and have a more positive outlook on it. Growing up, I feel like I overlooked Series 1 and wrote it off as a bit boring, but in hindsight I can appreciate just how good it was. Not only the character arc of the 9th Doctor and Rose, which I feel they work as a better dynamic than the 10th Doctor and Rose, since I feel their relationship is a bit more nuanced than simply just being in love, especially given at points the Doctor almost acts as a parental figure for her. But I can also appreciate elements like the overarching mystery box here. It gets a bit played out in subsequent seasons, but the Time War is such a great idea which has been around since the classic series and explored in expanded media, so it is a welcome addition to Doctor Who that really shakes things up, and unlike future mystery boxes, it is at least something that is a presence across multiple seasons. Even if Steven didn't like it, I appreciate the fact that he still kept it around during his first few seasons and recontextualized it in a way to give it a satisfying conclusion. One of the reasons the arc works so well in this particular season is that every episode plays a part in it, even if it's a minor one, so even the weaker episodes still can be a rewarding experience watching, as it offers the next piece of the puzzle. I feel Russell did a great job dealing with the elements of trying to make it seem accessible to newcomers, while also using stuff like the Autons and the Daleks as subtle confirmation to fans that what came before still exists and is still canon. Something else that I love about Series 1 and the Russell era in general is bringing back some of the writers from the Wilderness years and even exploring some of the ideas such as adapting Jubilee into Dalek. I do feel expanded media often gets overlooked, so the subtle love it gets here is greatly appreciated by me. It may have some dated visual effects and casting choices, but overall I consider Series 1 to be a major highlight of the revival. It's written in a way that leaves the door open for future seasons, but can be a good standalone experience if you just want to stop after this one season. Series 10 was the first and thankfully only season of Doctor Who I went into expecting to hate when it first came out after the disappointment that was Series 9. And thankfully my anger was misplaced because I absolutely loved it, and in my opinion has subsequently gotten better with each rewatch. This is the point where I feel the 12th Doctor really settled and Capaldi gave us his best work, and his relationship with Pearl Mackie as Bill is a major step up from Clara. She's probably not as interesting of a character overall, but she is a lot more likeable. This season somewhat sacrificed the secondary cast for giving us episodes which really focus on the relationship between the Doctor and Bill in order to make sure we like them, and thankfully for me it really paid off. And I was also surprised about how much I ended up liking Nardole as a character. He doesn't have the best start, but about halfway through the season, once he gets more focus and settles in as a major part of the team, he becomes really likeable, and this is by far one of my favourite modern TARDIS teams overall. Series 10 does share some of the issues of the prior, such as a really underwhelming mystery box, and Lie of the Land can be technically seen as a disappointing finale, but the fact that both elements were dropped halfway through the season instead of being dragged to the very end makes it a lot more refreshing, and instead they decide to focus on the far more interesting character arc of exploring whether or not Missy is actually capable of growing and becoming a better person. I feel this is a better example of trying to make the Master sympathetic than what they tried to do in Series 3, especially considering that she is the one insisting that she is improving rather than the Doctor trying to tell us that they're good when we see no evidence of that. And it also shows examples of the Doctor being a bit selfish in regards to this arc, but at least here it's a bit more well-meaning. You can see why he's doing it, and even if you don't agree, he faces the consequences pretty much straight away. There are some phenomenal stories. First, with a trilogy of episodes, the pilot, Smile and Thin Ice, Oxygen, which is an underrated gem. Extremis is easily the strongest of the otherwise disappointing Monk trilogy, and in my opinion this has the strongest finale out of any season of modern Doctor Who. From a fan service perspective to an emotional perspective, it is just a phenomenal story. So overall, Series 10 is by far my favourite season of modern Doctor Who.